our next speaker is Jan Rivers. Jan is a former public servant based in Wellington. She is the spokesperson for Genspect in New Zealand. Jan's comments will be about the possibility that adopting the Law Commission report would embed a right to gender medicine despite the lack of evidence for it, and the way that such a law would make it even harder for medical data collection to return to sex-based recording. If adopted as proposed, a law based on the report would cut across the government's own policies. Jan thinks that there is questionable wisdom in implementing further legal protections in favour of transgender people when transgender activists can seemingly cancel people as well as public discussion and events. So, welcome, Jan.
Kia ora koutou, and thank you for the opportunity to come and be present at this tonight. My presentation will be a little bit looser than the other two, but hopefully informative and helpful. And Janet has introduced it very well. I'm going to use some slides, so I'll just share those now. First of all, what I wanted to say is that we have done a brief response to the Minister of Justice, Paul Goldsmith, and it's available on publicly published as well on the Substack site of Genspect. So if you go to Genspect Substack and then the New Zealand section, it's the latest item that's been put there. I just wanted to mention a little bit about what Genspect is and what it does. So Genspect is an international organisation founded in 2021, founded principally by psychotherapists, counsellors, and the parents of children who were reporting as transgender or gender confused. It's now in, I think, about 20 countries. The New Zealand branch was founded in 2023. We founded with a webinar in November of 2023, and the video of that and some of the transcripts are online and available from our Substack page. So Genspect recognises trans identification as a mental health issue that really needs psychosocial supports. It advocates for ethical, non-medicalised responses to gender distress and raises awareness about the risks of inappropriate medication and promotes healthier outcomes for individuals, families, and broader society. There's one thing which I'd like to start by, because the other two speakers have mentioned this already, and it's about the capture of language in the Law Commission's report. And the Law Commission wouldn't be the first. In fact, my count comes to about 6 or 7, where a government agency has taken advice from a single perspective in order to create policy. And that has been done in our statistics department, in the Department of Internal Affairs, when the birth, deaths and marriages law was implemented. It's happened in social welfare and the Oranga Tamariki, our children's ministry, and more. And it seems to me that there is an incredible level of one-eyedness about this kind of approach, to think that good policy is made by approaching only one side of the equation in an area of contested public policy. You don't ask employers about how to make law for workplaces. You don't ask just the landlords to make policy about housing. So, to me, that's a really sort of obvious problem. My presentation will cover what was in the letter. So it discussed the idea that it will embed gender medicine as a human right, despite the lack of evidence. As Fern has already mentioned, it will cut across current government policy objectives. There are the issues already mentioned about social cohesion. I'd like to talk a little bit about the incoherence that relates to the findings in the UK Supreme Court case that clarified the definition of sex for their Equalities Act, but which this Law Commission report has failed to do, and then talk a little bit about the growing level of opposition, largely in response to bullying from transgender activists, which means that this is not the right time to be thinking about making the kind of changes that are proposed. Right, so Genspect's concerned about gender medicine are that it would embed the rights to gender treatment, despite the lack of evidence. It would mean that the medics would no longer be able to uphold the long-standing bioethical principle of do no harm. Of course, such treatment creates substantive risks to future fertility, sexual function, and physical health. This is becoming well known now, and it's likely to set children and young people on a lifelong path of medicalisation. Now, I haven't read the entire Law Commission report, although I read the issues paper 18 months ago several times. But one of the things that I have noticed in this report is that it takes very seriously the likelihood of fertility loss for young people with disorders of sexual development. But it doesn't make the same kind of comments about the likelihood of fertility loss or future sexual function for the young people who are asking for gender medicine. There's obviously increasing evidence of regret. It appears that gender medicine not only fails to prevent suicide, but it appears that it may be increasing the risk of completed suicides. So actually, what the people who tend to commit suicide and to have severely bad mental health with in the gender medicine area are those who are often being fully supported in their trans cross-sex identities. And just to point that one of the things that the Law Commission report does, and our own gender medicine, affirmative gender medicine, is to see trans children, not children with gender issues. And the whole idea of the creation of a trans child is a kind of a fascinating political success story by transgender activists. So why would it embed this? Well, first of all, one of the paragraphs in the Law Commission report says that gender affirmation exists and there are various treatments for it: clothing and changes, names and pronouns, legal gender affirmation, and medical gender affirmation. So we have it right there. This isn't about medicine as usually practiced. It's about medical gender affirmation, and it's also involves in our regime the whole idea of informed consent, which isn't the kind of informed consent that you usually have around medical interventions. It basically means we've told you what the impacts will be, and you kind of sign away your life to have this lifelong medical intervention. So the nature of gender medicine is there, identified as something that people with gender identities and non-binary people need. And then the Law Commission says that it would be possible for people to take cases to receive affirmative care. And these are the paragraphs that describe that. If a case, it sounds very sort of cool and clinical. If a case about access to gender affirming care was brought in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the plaintiff would need to establish that they were treated differently on the basis of gender identity, and this caused disadvantage. And then the government would have the opportunity to establish that any discrimination was justified. And then we would expect medical evidence and clinical considerations would be central to the court or tribunal's analysis. And maybe we might even give some deference to medical opinion. The most likely situation where this would arise, if gender identity was included in the law, would be in recognition of the fact that that gender medicine is not good for people. And that has already happened in Alberta, in the States, and in the US Scrimeti case. There were legal challenges to the intent to limit access to gender medicine. In the US Scrimeti case, that was a United States Supreme Court case, that case was won by the 25 or 26 US states that wanted to be able to rein in puberty blockers for children and young people, and cross-sex hormones in some cases. And the case in Alberta, Canada, the government has legislated to reduce the ability of young people to get puberty blockers, and there's now a legal challenge. So we don't want to create the situation, and as Fern said, we don't really want to create laws for which the end result is endless litigation and lawfare. We want to create laws where the intent is as clear as possible and the definitions are as clear as possible. And the reason why you would go to law is because of unanticipated circumstances, not because the law has been poorly drafted. So this is where I see the problem is that if a government saw that there was a problem with gender medicine, they would be highly incentivized to do nothing about it. And then just a little reminder about what's happening with our affirmative care at the moment, which is it's incredibly difficult to comment in New Zealand about the problems of gender medicine. Professionals who do invariably face censure. If psychotherapists, counsellors and psychologists are actually barred by their professional associations from doing other than affirm transgender identities, irrespective of the kind of explanatory logic of where a transgender identity comes from. And it seems to me there the issue is, would you assume that a transgender identity comes in some cases from social contagion, from classmates and school friends, as in the same way that for young women, things like anorexia, self-harm, and so on have arisen? Or would you think that suddenly people are discovering en masse their real selves, their full integrity, and that full integrity is realized as somebody who's in the wrong body? I mean, to me, the explanatory power of one is much, much greater than the other. So the threat of a discrimination case based on not providing care would have a chilling effect. So we wouldn't even have to have a case. We would just have to have the threat of a case, and it would embed even more deeply than we have at the moment the idea that gender medicine is a legitimate kind of medicine and that it should be provided to those who want it on an informed consent basis. From Genspect's perspective, if you like, the way that this Law Commission report has been constructed is that it takes a partisan view. And like I mentioned before, the Commission's working group consisted only of people seeking to maximise the rights of transgender people and non-binary people, but not seeking to consider other rights. This is about the definition of sex. This is what the Law Commission said. We set out our understanding of the different ways the term sex is used in fields such as biology, medicine, and law. No meaning that could be given to the word sex can justify denying people protection from discrimination based on their gender identity. I mean, this kind of language really shows the extent to which the inputs into this whole effort were one-sided. I'd like to just demonstrate the sort of extent to which the Law Commission has taken on the transgender view. I looked up the word, the different words for the definition of non-binary, and by coming up with that, I came up with a whole list of other words for non-binary across multiple different languages, and it included the word anoyedd, which is the Welsh apparently for non-binary, and I did a bit of background research. It seems to have suddenly appeared as a neologism in 2022. It has no existence in any dictionary before that. And yet our transgender community were able to convey that information to the Law Commission for them to faithfully reproduce it in their Law Commission report. Fern mentioned the way that what happens with the Law Commission report is that the government has a certain amount of time to consider it and to consider whether to adopt it as a whole, in part, or to set it aside. And as Fern said about education, what would happen is that the report goes directly against what's currently happening in education with the removal of gender identity issues from the new curriculum. But there are other areas where the same thing would happen. So our government has decided that it will retain terms, sex-based terms for women in the health sector, instead of terms like cervixes, pregnant people, and chest feeding. And I don't know, I've got TA there, the Ministry of Health has recently suggested much more cautious approach to gender medicine for children and young people. And the government is currently consulting on changes to Public Services Act. And when the Labour government implemented the Public Services Act, it had a requirement for boards and chief executives of government departments to implement diversity and equity across their agency. And what's happened with that has been that gender ideology organisations have had a place at the centre of government influencing policy. So these organisations that have very little respect for public sector norms have been right at the centre of our government. The current National Party are proposing to remove those guidelines about diversity and equity. But of course, the Law Commission report would go completely against that. So basically, if the gender identity legislation were put in place, it would be difficult to legislate in these and possibly a number of other areas. One of the things which came up in the UK Supreme Court case was a discussion about the coherence of the law, that if you had sex meaning two different things, essentially the law could not be coherent. And this was from an article written by on a Substack called Void If Removed, and it was a description of the meaning of sexual orientation if the Scottish Government's assessment of what sex meant was put in place. And basically it meant that sexual orientation became meaningless. And you don't need much imagination to kind of think about how that works. But basically, if a man changes sex or changes gender, his partner is then a lesbian. He is then a lesbian. You know, it's sort of if a young woman transitions to male, is her female partner then a heterosexual young woman? Is she now, if her partner is also a trans man, are the couple, the couple of young women now a gay couple? That's the kind of thing, the incoherence that would be brought into our public policy if we go ahead with this Law Commission report. The thing that I wanted to mention about social cohesion is that transgender and non-binary people and the whole transgender movement have accrued considerable public power. They can apply considerable pressure to public servants. And organisations, as I mentioned, like in the caring professions, are pretty much unable to provide other than affirmative care. So it seems to me that it's dangerous at this stage to think about implementing this Law Commission report. And what I've got here, this next slide, is these are two surveys taken 4 years apart by YouGov in the UK, and they are a summary of British attitudes to transgender rights taken 4 years apart. And on the right-hand side is the earlier one, and on the left-hand side is the more recent one. And basically, I think what's happening is that as the kind of no debate has come to an end across the world, but specifically, particularly in the UK, as people start to understand what the demands of self-identification and what the demands of the transgender movement are, they're becoming less and less acceptable. So this isn't about transphobia or fear. If you look at the top, should people be able to identify as a different gender than the one recorded at birth? People are pretty much relatively happy with that, but it's the other areas where this impacts that are starting to become very contentious. Yeah, there's just a really good article about the bullying and cancellations that's happened, which I recommend you to. But basically, if you're going to implement law that sees people imprisoned for misgendering or fined, as is happening in Canada and Australia at the moment, you're going to be implementing a law that reduces social trust and reduces the idea of the idea that we have common interests and that we look after each other rather than that we are opposed to each other. And I just think that's extremely dangerous. Finally, and this is my last slide, I was hoping to put some links here to some of the other really good written material that's been put out. But in particular, Annie O'Brien, who used to be the spokeswoman for Speak Up for Women, has written 2 magnificent articles. And a former judge, David Harvey, is going to be writing an in-depth analysis over the next 3 or 4 weeks. And a Substack called The Ministry Has Fallen has also written a good piece on why we should be opposed to the Law Commission report. So that's me. Sorry, I've gabbled a bit, but thank you for the opportunity to come and talk about this.
Oh, thank you very much. That was wonderful, Jan. And it's great the way the 3 speakers have all covered different areas, which are all really important. And terrible to think what might happen to our young people if we go further down this track.